Hi, I'm Malika Bilal in for Femi OK, and you're in the stream. This week, South Africa is marking 40 years since the Soweto student uprising, a pivotal moment in the struggle against apartheid. Well, today we'll meet 4 South African activists to find out just how much life has changed 4 decades on. Our digital producer, Omar Madar, is here, and he's looking out for all of your live feedback. Omar, I think it's fair to say that not many people in our community were alive in 1976, but the legacy of that moment, I'm sure, affects some of them.
Certainly. For people who are around and for people who are reflecting back on it, we have a lot of people who are talking about the significance of the Soweto uprising. We found this tweet by Thesna who says, "I was a primary school kid in '76, and photos from the Soweto uprising showed the horrors of apartheid. That those images remained with me until today." And then from our community, we have Ned here who says the Soweto uprising was the spark of activism in the fight against apartheid. Today, it shows the importance that youth play in South Africa. Now, we are going to be talking about that history as well as the current protests. And folks at home, this is your conversation as well, so be sure to tweet us using the hashtag AJStream.
Hi, I'm Lester Kivet, and I'm a journalist for ENCA in Cape Town, South Africa, and I'm in the stream.
On June 16, 1976, thousands of Black South African students took to the streets after a government decree forced all Black schools to use Afrikaans and English as languages of instruction. The demonstrations against institutional racism turned deadly after police used tear gas and opened fire on peaceful protesters. It's estimated at least 170 people were killed and more than 1,000 injured in the days that followed. Well, the crackdown made international headlines, shocking people with the reality of South Africa's structural racism and inequality. Apartheid was dismantled in 1994, but some say today's born-free generation is still facing similar grievances from the past. So what's changed for young South Africans since the Soweto uprising, and how has it impacted youth activism in the country today? Well, to help us talk about this, we're joined by Busi Mukambuzi, a South African student activist. Noor Niftahuddin is a professor of history at the University of the Witwatersrand, or WITS, in Johannesburg. Also in Johannesburg, Simamkele Dilakabu, who is a student activist and storyteller, and Black consciousness leader Ishmael Mnisi. He was there on the ground during the 1976 protests. Welcome everyone to the stream. Noor, what do you remember about June 16th, 1976?
So I think it's important to kind of ask the question, why was it, as you introduced, that on June 16th, and in fact beyond that, tens of thousands of young Black students, women and men, protested, even as they were faced by the brutality of the South African state. And the trigger of the rebellion was, as you said, that students opposed the imposition by the apartheid government of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. And beyond that, very quickly, rebelled against what was called Bantu education. And I think it's extremely important to kind of focus on that, because what the Bantu education system did was it attempted, or it produced an education system that was deliberately inferior to white education and attempted to produce young Blacks to work in menial labor and tend to the needs of white people. This was the foremost reason why young Black people rebelled in 1976. But on the day, in fact, in the late morning, when the police shot Hastings Ndlovu and Hector Peterson, within minutes that rebellion proceeded from being a struggle against Bantu education to being, in the words of the students, a rebellion against the system of apartheid, against bad education, and against, as you said, institutional racism. The question that we have today is that in our school system, and as the fees must fall and the roads must fall movement very profoundly put on our agenda at the end of last year and this year, is that even though we don't have institutional racism, the problems that affected young Black people in the 1970s and the 1980s, which was that the system prevented young Black people from reaching their aspirations, from fulfilling their ambitions.
Right.
Young black people today still feel that the system today prevents them from fulfilling their ambitions.
So Noor, you raised a lot of really interesting things there, and I want to kind of parse apart some of that. One of them was the name of someone who died in this protest. This is a tweet that people are sharing online. Hector Peterson, he was one of the first youth to be killed, has long been a symbol of youth resistance, and this was the photo that really shocked, I would say, many people around the world when they saw this and saw that there were youth, there were kids as young as he was, Hector, one of the first casualties or the first casualty, and you could see it people could see it for their own eyes. They could see what was happening. How then are people online, Omar, reacting to what the professor said, and then pictures like this that are being shared?
That's right. You have people, younger people, who are reflecting on the loss that happened 40 years ago. People like Black Sweat over here, who says it's a struggle to honor their bravery and live the carefree lives that they fought for, while many of the key people there remain missing. Ishmael, I want to throw this to you. Do you feel like we can just move on and look forward at this point, or do you still feel like there's something more that we need to get closure about events from 40 years ago?
I would like to say that in as much as Prof has talked about the symptoms of our oppression then, I think then we have to say that what was lost was our land, were disempowered, dispossessed, and were exploited. And 1976 came. We can't just say the struggle is complete. Any struggle is relative, it's not absolute. The journey is still remaining to be covered. We still need to fight for many things. We can't close all the time. As long as you are alive, you need to struggle for something, for an idea, rather than to say, hallelujah, everything is accomplished.
Ishmael, you were actually there, though, in 1976. Take us through what it was like for you being a young person then.
For me, when 1976 came, I was completing my teaching training. I was ready to come back to Soweto and teach the following year. But during that year, 1976, I was faced with making a choice whether to write an exam conditionally, promising that wherever I teach, I'll make children obedient and not riot. I turned my back on that type of conditional examination, and I left the University of the North, and thankfully I had to make a bonfire of all my books, and I came back home to join those who had wounds and those who were arrested and others died.
And as you're talking, Busi here is nodding, and I'm sure, I know from what you told our producers ahead of the show that your father was there as a youth in Soweto. He grew up there, went to school there.
Yeah.
What does he tell you about what happened?
So both my parents actually grew up in Soweto, but my dad was a bit more involved, specifically on the day on June 16, 1976. He was 16. He had just turned 16. It was just turned 16, and so he was a young man. And he describes it, as a day that was just a rush. So there were all these school kids going to school as per usual, but everyone knew that there was a simmering tension. There's something going on, and everyone is talking, and it has to stop. And that was the day when they got to their school gates. There were older students standing at the gate saying, "We're all going to Orlando. We're all moving in this one direction." Orlando was the meeting venue where all the students met for a mass meeting. And he remembers, being part of that rush of thousands of students just moving towards, this one big school in Orlando for this meeting with the older students. And, according to what he tells me, that day was actually supposed to be just a day where they meet, where they draft a memorandum. And it was going to be over 3 days that they demonstrate to the government that, we don't want to be taught in a language that is foreign, in a language that represents our oppressor.
Right.
And the police, of course, disrupted that process, and it turned violent. So it was very interesting to hear that from Wab Ishmael, and that tension between teachers, parents, and students.
Right.
We actually got a video comment from Alex talking about current protests. She says she's currently facing disciplinary action in the University of Cape Town. Take a listen to what she has to say.
June 1976 and the Soweto uprising was an important turning point in the history and politics of this country, in the same way in which the formation of Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movements in this country is a turning point in student politics in this country. We are also met with the same kind of apartheid style tactics of repression as young people were in 1976. So not only do we have to deal with police brutality, arrests, and that kind of thing, we are also met with the might of the institution where young people's futures are jeopardized.
So, Simam Kele, what do you think of this comparison between the protests from 40 years ago with the current protests that are taking place? Do you think that's a fair comparison?
Definitely, I do. And activists that were there, people like Seth Mazibuko, agrees. But I think I want to touch on the point that is made by Alex, is that what does it mean for our country to celebrate June 16 while students have been beaten, arrested, suspended, and expelled from their institutions? Black students who come from poverty, who their only way out of poverty really is getting an education somehow. So for me, I think this day is more of a day of mourning for me. Not only mourning for the lives that were lost in June 1976, but also the futures that have been destroyed by the institutional might of management and the state.
Noor, do you think that's fair? You heard in the video comment she referred to some of the tactics that students today are facing as apartheid-style tactics. Do you think that's a fair comparison?
I think it is to a significant extent. Certainly, over the last 6 months, students involved in the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall have had to confront, a brutality. They've had to confront interdicts, expulsions, and the like. And I think the one important thing, the point that the students have made when they compare the brutality of the apartheid state with what they're confronting is not to get involved in what students call a kind of Olympics of kind of brutality and of pain and so on. Because certainly we've not had a situation, at least amongst the students, where hundreds of students have been killed, as was the case in 1976. But of course, we've had in South Africa instances such as the killing of mine workers at Marikana. So there's the kind of continuation of state violence against protests is very pervasive. And it may be the case that now students have not had to confront the same extent of police brutality, but that does not mean that the state isn't brutal. And we have also seen at some campuses where the management of universities have acted quite brutally against students and have, through interdicts and expulsions, in fact, undermined the right of students to protest. So I think that one has to be, I think there are some comparisons, but one has to be careful about making direct comparisons, but at the same time, be sensitive to the continuation of police brutality in South Africa that confronts not only students, but protests as a whole in the country.
Yes. I agree with Professor, is that South Africa has no tolerance for protest culture, but yet the state can host celebrations really.
Well, okay, so what you just said was really big. So I want to show our audience this and then have you respond, elaborate on what you were going to say. This is a picture here. This is 1976. This is the protest in Soweto. And then above you see 2015, and this is the photos that were granted to us via Noor. Thank you very much. These are protesters who are marching to the ANC headquarters, the ruling African National Congress headquarters in Johannesburg for the Fees Must Fall protest, and that's something you all have mentioned. We've done shows on it here at the stream, and it was a call to make sure that school fees were lowered because they were increasing. So then looking at that, can you elaborate on what you mean about there not being an appetite or a culture of protest?
The funny thing is that I was there on that day, and many of us gotten beaten, tear gassed by the cops, and that's a story that's not told because the journalist had left at that time. So on that day, we thought as students we were there to occupy Luthuli House. But because of, politics and the political interests that were there, because we had student leaders who were leading Fees Must Fall, but who were working for the government that perpetuates a system of black exclusion, of black oppression. So I think 20 of us, majority black women, after those students have left, after all of those crowds left, we sat there and occupied Luthuli House. And in our occupation, we were met with police brutality and violence. And it's not a narrative that's reported on because all the journalists had left. So when I say there's no tolerance for protest culture, I don't only mean Fees Must Fall. Andries Tatane, an activist who was protesting for water, was killed in this country by cops. Professor mentioned Marikana. So there are more cases like this where a person might not actually be physically killed, but you can still see the bullet wounds, you can still see the rubber bullets, you see the tension that it has. So it is evident that protest culture in this country is not tolerated by the state.
Brutality is one thing, but then there's the actual demands on making progress that people are commenting on online as well.
Yeah.
We have Action Commandant over here who says, honestly, we are still fighting gutter education today. A lot has changed, but education is not equal nor free yet. And then we have Clifford over here who is wondering, is the education system decolonized enough for improvement of black lives in 2016? Contrast that with 1976. Ishmael, I'll toss this one to you. Can you say that significant improvement has been made over those 40 years?
I think over the previous years, what has been done was things which are physical and quantitative, things you can measure. You can count the number of schools which have been built. You can count the number of hospitals built. You can go on and present quantifiable things, measurable things. But in reality, we found that the education of black children is worse now. They can't read, they can't count. You can find that the institutions we have are empty because people will be asked to go to a university, to a hospital, and when you arrive in those institutions, you find that there's nothing which you came to get. Rather than get education, you find yourself under the shade of new, beautiful buildings, but without education. And therefore, when we see children, young people burning institutions, be they clinics, libraries, and universities, we're surprised. It's because there are false promises of the institutions which we have that don't uphold the values and the principle for which the Constitution, the world is celebrating, is standing for.
Malik, I just want to wind back to a point made by Simamkele and just connected to what Ishmael said. For me, I've always felt that we've come a long way, and we can't deny that we have, but I think we went the wrong way. And I think when the time when we went the wrong way was 1994 with the negotiated settlement.
Is that the year you were born?
The year I was born. And people born my year were referred to as the born frees in our country, the people who were born, when freedom was attained. But I think, like what Ishmael says, we have to ask ourselves how substantive that freedom was. And for me, as someone also who did participate in Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, particularly on the day when we had the national shutdown, where universities across the country marched to, very pivotal areas of our government. Osimamgele in Johannesburg went to Luthuli House. We were at Parliament in Cape Town. And what happened on that day for me reminded me of a lot of what my father told me about 1976. We got there with demands to present to the government with one voice and were disrupted by state force. We went there and we were told you have 15 minutes to leave the Parliament compound. My dad tells me they had 3 minutes to leave the meeting space in Orlando. Students were arrested. I have a friend, Khotsi Chikane, who was actually arrested and charged with treason.
Wow.
And his father was charged with treason all those years ago. Students were arrested, tear gas, stun grenades. And like Simamkele says, these are not stories that have been reported, that have been covered by journalists. And I think it's because we're so afraid of what it might do to this myth of a rainbow nation. If we come out and we say, this is what was happening to students in 2015.
So you're mentioning that the sense that you've moved in the wrong direction, and we see actually that kind of generational tension online as well. We have the official Nelson Mandela Foundation tweeting out, "It's okay to say that fees must fall, but why must you burn our infrastructure?" And one of the people who responded is Typo Queen, saying they use Nelson Mandela to push the ANC's agenda. "We are not our parents. We will not waver." Noor, what do you make of this attitude that maybe a previous generation wavered on achieving full justice in a sense?
I want to say
this is
that
a fascinating.
Ishmael and Noor want to address that. Noor, go ahead, and then Ishmael, you'll follow.
I think this is a fascinating debate, right? I think that one of the first things that one needs to recognize, and just focusing very quickly on something that Ishmael said, part of what happened, an important part of what happened in 1994, which is kind of prevalent in the education system, is that the class divide has become very pronounced. So the education system is divided along class lines. But in South Africa, class is fundamentally also about race. So if you're living in a black township or in a squatter camp and an informal settlement, you are very likely to be in a school that is badly equipped, has unqualified teachers, and therefore the kind of education that you're getting won't be significantly better than the kind of education that was provided under Bantu education. So class and race is imbricated, is profoundly synonymous. I think that the argument that the 76 generation did not fulfill the kind of intentions or ambitions of emancipation is interesting and provocative. But I think that there are some challenges in kind of raising that argument.
Give us one of the challenges, because I want to get Ishmael in here before we run out of time. What are those challenges?
Well, first of all, I think that the 76 generation, the 76 uprising was a profound, important turning point. It broke the quiescence, the political quiescence of the 1960s, and inaugurated the rebellion against apartheid that occurred both in the townships and in the workplaces. In that sense, it was a profoundly important moment of emancipation. Now, the point that Busi raised, I think is important, is that the rebellion that brought down apartheid also created the opportunity for a negotiated settlement. And the reality is it was that negotiated settlement that created shackles in the new democratic dispensation.
Okay, Professor, I'm going to pause you there with the shackles, because I want Ishmael to pick up here. Ishmael, we have less than a minute, but go ahead with your response.
I want to say that when 94 came, it's not the generation of 1976 which took over. It was, in fact, its predecessors, the old generation which was on Robben Island and the exile. The generation of 76, to some extent, if I'm to admit something, is that they deferred to those people who came from exile or prison. The struggle was inside, and the fact that we also came to accept, all of us, the new and the old generation, that government will deliver things for us, they will deliver better education, than to see all of us taking the struggle for good education and seeing the new government and new rulers as facilitators of the change which we wanted. Now, I think we all failed, were in default, because we did not really accept that the journey to liberation is not a constitution. A constitution is only an environment which allows us to exert ourselves, to move forward with intention and achieve the dreams of our struggle and the ideals for which we all aspire.
Ishmael, your words there, all of our guests were nodding there. The journey to liberation is not a constitution. I had to write them down. We'll pick up with them in the post show at stream.aljazeera.com, because that's all the time we have now in the main show. But we're taking all of our guests there and the community, so join us. We'll see you there. Hello, welcome to the online post show. We're discussing the 40th anniversary of the Soweto student uprising and the challenges that young South Africans are facing today. We had to pause the main conversation with these beautiful, deep words. The journey to liberation is not a constitution. They were said by Ishmael Mnisi. And as you were speaking, our guests were nodding. And so I told Busi in the little break before we entered into the post show, I'm going to start with you because you look like you really wanted to respond. And she said, actually, go to Sima Nkale because she is really passionate about that. So Sima, go ahead.
Okay. So, you know, our constitution is praised around the world for not only guaranteeing, you know, basic human rights, like rights to association and protest, etc., but rights, socioeconomic rights. So water, etc., and education are things that are guaranteed by our constitution, and housing, etc. But then you see a lot of violation of that exact same constitution. For instance, our constitution says that it was ruled in the Constitutional Court that you can't evict someone who has a shack or is homeless without providing alternative housing. Yet thousands of black people in this country are evicted from their shacks, just like it happened in Shackville. So they were demonstrating when they demolished Shackville at UCT, they were demonstrating what they do to many people's homes in this country without providing alternative housing. And even with that alternative housing, it's inadequate. It's often in homes, homeless shelters, for instance, where people can't even be with their families. And so even our constitution also protects private property. And that's the debate that many people have in the country. For instance, my political party, the EFF, once offered actually their stake in parliament to give the ANC to amend that and change land redistribution policies in the country.
Right.
And so the stolen land that was given to black people is returned.
You know, when you're speaking, what strikes me is the thought, Busi, that enough people have not received or say they have not received enough improvements to their lives since the days of Nelson Mandela and those who were integral in that struggle. What would you say to that? What do you say to those people?
I think it's true. And I think something that explains the reason why that's the case is because we've sort of thought of political freedom as something that is separate from economic freedom. And I think the celebration was here, we have this document that, protects us, that gives us certain political rights, but they won't pair up with economic rights. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, for a person who is poor, who's living on less than $1 a day, how much access do they really have to their human rights? How much power do they have in the courts of law? How much of a say do they have in the media? And those are real questions about substantive equality, about substantive redistribution. And so it's not enough to say you have, a great constitution that is heralded around the world. You have to ask yourself what you're doing as a present government to address the past and not to ignore it and not to, rainbow wash it and call people born frees in an attempt to change the narrative about a lived experience, about something that is very real. I was born in 1994, but I was born in the same matchbox house that my father was born in 1959. And so what can you really say as a government today to people who come to you and say, we don't feel free, we don't feel equal? You have to acknowledge it. And you have to think about how you're going to fix that. Or else, fees must fall, roads must fall. Those are just signs of a looming danger, I feel, that's coming if our government doesn't respond and take the youth seriously.
We were talking a little bit earlier about the tension that exists intergenerationally on this, and we have more people who are still talking about this online. The Lamborghini over here says, I'm so tired of hearing how the youth of '76 would be ashamed of the youth of today. Please, come on, goes on to say. They weren't too hard on patriarchy and sexism either. 40 years later, how many female student leaders of '76 do we know about? Noor, do you think that's a fair criticism of the earlier movement?
Yes, I think so.
But it's not.
So we have a disagreement there.
So I think the criticism is right, but I think the problem lies elsewhere. Because in reality, as your pictures show, and in fact, Ishmael is a good person to speak about this because Sibongile Mkabela was one of the leading women activists of 1976. And as your pictures reveal, young women were very prominent in the uprising of 76. The problem is that the way the narratives have evolved has been to prioritize the role of young men in the leadership positions and therefore have erased the role of young women in that uprising. It is also true that within the movements of liberation, that issues such as patriarchy, such as sexism, and oppression of people with various and different sexual orientations have been a problem in the movements, and those things have not been addressed. And therefore, the Fees Must Fall movement, in my view, one of the important advances of the Fees Must Fall movement, the Rhodes Must Fall movement, is the way in which they have placed on the table in a very profound way the question of gender, of sexuality, and the leading role of women. And those issues were not raised systematically in the movements of 1976, notwithstanding the critical role that women played in that movement.
Interesting nuance there. Ishmael, do you want to pick that up?
I would like to say I grew up in the Black consciousness movement, and I was surrounded by people, women who were leaders. In the Black People's Convention, Mrs. Winnie Kware was the president of BPC. And there are many women I can celebrate within that movement, some living and some dead. And when AZAPO was formed, for which I was first chairman, and within the first 3 years, we have had a deputy president, Mrs. Nombulela Mkefa. She was Kobas then. She became a deputy president. I married someone who led, and I have been led by women. Even from my family, I never knew a granddad. I was raised by strong females who took charge of their lives. I think for me, we can only support women's struggle because if we are not part of that struggle, no struggle becomes meaningful if it will just preserve the benefits and the advantage of one sector of our society at the expense of another one.
I'm glad that you gave a shout out there to your wife. I actually have a picture of her on my screen here because the stream reached out to her to be a part of this show as well, but she was traveling, but of course one of the leaders in those 76 protests. So thank you for acknowledging that. We're almost out of time here, but I want to go.
I can't help saying.
You can, no, of course, because you live in the same house, so you can't help it.
I can't help saying I see a black rose because she was able to stand among other people. That no man will invite women to lead. When women step forward and lead, some of us will follow.
Wise words there. I'm going to leave them there. I want to wrap up here just with a roundtable very quickly of our guests because we're running out of time, but how you will be marking this 40th anniversary. Mnisi, I'll start here with you. You mentioned it in the pre-show, but now that we're in our post-show and we've had this 40 minutes of conversation, how will you be marking that anniversary?
I think I take what Professor Noor said very seriously about avoiding the politicization of what June 16, 1976 should represent for students today. I think it's a time of deep reflection, like I said before, and I think it's a time of really questioning our government and holding them accountable rather than celebrating something that I feel for me should not be celebrated.
Seema? How will you be marking it?
Yeah, I'll be mourning. I'll because the political discourse in post-apartheid South Africa has been to celebrate June 16 like it was a celebration, the killing of young people. How can you celebrate that? And them trying to depoliticize this day so that we don't draw correlations between the current state and the previous apartheid state. They choose for us to celebrate and be in concert. So I won't be doing that. I'll be mourning with other Fordist activists, and I'll be remembering in gratitude the thousands of young people that sacrificed their lives for us.
Noor, you teach this and you study this. What does that mean for how you'll be marking it?
So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to be critically reflecting as an historian, but also as a parent of a son who is beginning to become politically aware. And in fact, I am going to go to Orlando West early in the morning to engage young people there, but very quickly leave there to avoid the pantomime that is going to emerge there from about 9 o'clock, when the government is going to lead a march and then go and celebrate with music in a stadium. So I'm going to avoid all of that, but I will be in Orlando to engage in some critical reflection with young people.
Ishmael?
For me, I would say I will not mourn, I will not cry, but I'll be saying, if there are people to rebel, people who are to dissent from what we see today, June 16 is a good sign to launch us for another revolution in our lifetime.
Viva!
There was a raised fist there from Seema. I want to thank all of our guests. That's all the time we have for today. I want to get the last word from our community, though.
There's a sentiment we got a lot of. I'll read just two of these tweets. IG Forever Bling says, long live the spirit of the 76th youth, because they fought for the freedom we have today, though we are still not 100% free. And Tandi over here says, a lot has changed, but much still needs to be done. We're looking forward to a brighter future.
And two of the hashtags you can use to follow along with those anniversary commemorations are June 16th and Youth Day, among others. Of course, you can always follow hashtag AJ Stream, where we'll be covering the story. Thanks for joining us today.